Hello, everyone. My name is Hector Herrero. I'm a Senior Director on Program Management at Fortrea, working on radiopharmaceuticals for the last 15 years. Welcome to this podcast today. Before we jump in, I would like to present a quick picture. So imagine a patient arrives at a site early in the morning, fasting, anxious, ready to receive the treatment. The team is prepared, the scanner time is reserved, everyone is on a schedule. And then they receive a message. The shipment is delayed by 45 minutes. In many trials, that's frustrating, but the things can continue that day. In radiopharma, it can mean the dose is no longer viable, the visit must be rescheduled, and a patient loses a day or more and the treatment opportunity. So in this episode, we will unpack 5 practical questions. Why logistics is not just support, how the short half-lives force new planning methods, what zero tolerance really looks like, who feels the impact first when something breaks and something does not go as expected, and why logistics often determines whether a patient can be dosed at all. So welcome to this Fortrea podcast. And well, as I mentioned, in many clinical trials, logistics can be seen as a support function, important, but operation in the background. In radiopharmaceuticals studies, this is a little bit different. Logistics isn't just supporting the science, it often determines whether the science can happen at all. So to explore why, I'm joined by Graham McCarthy, Commercial Director at Pharma, who is going to bring us a deep experience across the radiopharma ecosystem. Graham, welcome.
Hello, Hector. It's very nice to meet you, and thanks for having me.
Okay, would you like to briefly introduce yourself and your role at Pharma?
Yes, my name is Graham McCarthy. I am the Commercial Director of Pharma, specialised in supporting companies carry out their clinical studies, both for EU and UK markets, and also supporting clients as they move from clinical into commercialisation. We hold our own licenses known as MIAs, which allows companies from, let's say, US or Canada, import their radiopharmaceutical products into the EU and be QP released, so it can actually go to the study. So I suppose in dealing with sponsors, manufacturers, etc., we often help in these regulatory filings for the studies. We also get the site inspection ready, and we also make sure they're compliant with Annex 21. So again, there's no delays when it comes to scaling the studies up. My role within MIAS is to support pharma companies to make sure they have everything in place from both a GMP and GDP perspective. So again, we're trying to make it as virtual and as streamlined as possible.
Thank you, Graham. So let's go into the conversation. To set the scene, Graham, when you look across different studies and sponsors, what's the most common misconception you see about radiopharma logistics?
There are 3 that come to mind. First, and I suppose the biggest misconception, is the perception that airlines and customs agents will handle the shipment with greater sense of urgency than their products. Unfortunately, it's just not the case. And this lack of priority has a big potential impact on delivery timings for when it moves from the US or Canada into Europe. Another common misconception is thinking that the closest airport next to manufacturing site is the best option. Again, that's not always the case. So unless an airport has a direct route to the destination airport in the EU, the product may still have to go through a main hub, and again, cause needless delays. And the third and the most fundamental one is, a few years ago, there was a thing known as Annex 21 that was implemented within Europe, which means that for all studies or commercial products entering Europe from a third country, it has to have a designated touchdown point known as a site of importation. So traditional sponsors would think that, okay, I'm doing a study in Germany, I can fly the product straight from the site into Germany. The reality is, for our own studies, our site of importation is Belgium. So the product has to be factored in that it goes from the US into Belgium and then on to the third country.
So let's go into some details and start with the big one. So why isn't logistics just a support function in radiopharmaceutical trials?
Well, look, logistics is so vital because radiopharmaceutical products simply can't be stockpiled. It's a just-in-time model. So essentially, when it's manufactured, A dose has to be shipped to the other side of the world and administered to a patient within the given time frame and the K rate of the product. So basically, it has to factor in manufacturing cycles, carrier timings, customs, quality, and even clinical site opening hours. Usually, what we see with most of our studies, everything has to be done within a 96-hour time limit. So basically, as part of the study, it's so vital having the right logistics partner identified so you can work with them to plan their route, get all the critical steps out of the way, and make sure there's door-to-door from either customs, IOR, and final mile to make sure there's continuity. And I suppose back to the initial question, why it's not just a support function. As the clinical studies scale, it's really important to see the logistics vendor as your partner so they can actually change routes and scale with you so they can get around capacity issues.
When you're advising, you are giving advices to sponsors or sites, what's the earliest moment in the study design where logistics needs to be on the table?
The earlier the better, but not in isolation. Usually the quality vendor like a Myas or someone like this should be involved. On paper, something might look straightforward, but logistically, a country may not be the easiest location to get a product into. There might be extra licenses required to bring a product in. By involving a logistics partner early in the process, it gives more flexibility and time to plan and carry out mock shipments of hot product. So you can actually test all processes in the supply chain end to end, including both communication process, transport, and even from the site, using the material to calibrate machines to show it actually, from a fundamental level, everything is set up correctly.
I think one thing which is important to mention is when logistics becomes part of the product design or the study design, the better said, it of course changes a little bit the accountability. So what are the operational metrics you watch most closely, and how should the sponsors think about them?
Well, from a logistics perspective solely, being on time for the study is expected. And I suppose there's the reason around having mock shipments as part of the setup. But the main metrics really is if a product has only 96-hour shelf life. One metric is collection time from manufacturing site, and the second metric will always be the delivery time that's been agreed in the SLA with the clinical site. So it means that if anything happens in the mean, at least contingencies can be put in place.
So let's talk a little bit about the scientific reality that drives mostly all of these logistical consideration, right? Which is the short half-life or not short half-life that of course change everything. So in your opinion, how do these short half-life change how studies needs to be planned?
So in planning, it's always kind of consider direct flights rather than any redirects. Make sure your logistics partner have custom agents are available at all main airports. And make sure you send your documentation in advance so you can check with customs in advance, see the clearance status, liaising directly with the clinical team, and informing your QP at the I suppose the status of the shipment, just to make sure that the full batch gets to patient in time.
Okay, can you give us a simple example of what this decay means operationally? Okay, not the physics background, of course, but for the planning reality.
So typically, the most common material that we see coming from the US, Canada, or other third countries has a half-life of about 96 hours. So an example, product is made in a manufacturer and it's usually in a patient on a Monday. So when a product is made, it's generally made at a more concentrated level than it needs to be at the time it enters the patient. So operationally, the logistics vendor has to work around this time frame to make sure the medicine gets from the manufacturing site to the clinic or it can't be used. That means the patient suffers. So basically, the logistics vendor will always have to tie in with the manufacturers, customs, QP, clinical team, and it has to be clear lines of communication in place. It doesn't always go straightforward. And I suppose from a planning reality is if there's any delays, it means that a vendor will look at alternative routes to make sure it gets to the site on time.
And one thing I would like also to mention here is we are not really talking only about the injection. We are talking about imaging slots, blood draws, monitoring windows. Um, they are, a lot of things which can be really impacted if the planning is not done properly here. So it is really, really important that everything here is really very well reviewed and discussed before we really start, right? So, this also, of course, bring us to the phrase that probably all of you are hearing a lot when we are talking about radiopharmaceutical studies, which is the zero tolerance for delays. So, what does zero tolerance for delays really mean in practice, Rahul?
In zero tolerance, like what we generally encounter is in all our studies, we always ensure that we validate our shipping routes. So we have clear planning, communications, fallbacks, and lines of escalation between sponsors, clinical teams, and the QP to minimize risk. Now, there is a chance always of a force majeure event. That's always going to be out of your control. But I suppose to support zero tolerance, what we find is a lot of the transport vendors we use would have live GPS trackers fitted. So at least that it gives direct communication. So if something does happen, it can either contingencies can be put in place or the clinical team can be let know just to make sure a patient isn't suffering at the hospital.
Talking a little bit more about potential fails in this process. So, who is impacted first?
Unfortunately, it's always the patient because ultimately at the end of it, the whole purpose of the entire study is to treat patients.
Yeah, that patient first impact is really, really important. We always need to keep that in mind. So in a conventional trial, a delay can be an inconvenient, of course, could lead to some, problems for the patient. But here a delay can mean the patient simply can be dosed that day. And not in all studies with radiopharmaceuticals, but in many studies with radiopharmaceuticals, we are talking about oncology patients. And when these patients really need the treatment, these patients are in a very difficult situation in many cases. So when the patient is impacted first, the human side can get lost in operational discussions. Okay, why, in your opinion, also, Graham, why does logistics often determine whether a patient can be dosed? I think we have already mentioned some of these topics, but I think it might be worth also to ask this question.
There's limitations around manufacturing schedule. So basically, usually products coming from third countries might be midweek manufacture or it could be weekend manufacture. So it means that it limits how much material can actually come into Europe, and it also limits the amount of releases can happen at a given day. So there's limitations at the clinical side as well. So I suppose the limitations is, so for example, let's say I start a study and there's 2 doses a month. If it gets past a certain threshold, you might need to look at alternative airlines, you might need to alternative airports. And again, it is a big limitation because everything has to happen in that same specific timeline.
If you have to describe this as a chain, because of course there are multiple steps here in all this process, what are, in your opinion, the weak links that most often break in this chain? Could be release timing, transport, last mile delivery, site readiness.
It's always going to be the airline because it's the one part that's out of control of the chain. You can have contingency plans in place, but the reality is that external factor is your biggest risk.
Okay, so one thing I would like here to mention for all of you listening. So here is a quick checklist that you can sanity check before first patient in when we are setting up a radiopharmaceutical study in any site. So do we really have a backward plan from injection time to manufacturing and release? Is there a single escalation path with name, contacts, and decision authority about what to do if something unexpected happens? That is really, really relevant. Is the said dosing day set? So have we discussed with the site how all the process is going to be done? right? And who is going to be the responsible person for each of those steps: the receipt of the IMP, the preparation, the administration, and then imaging if needed, samples draw if needed, etc. And in all of these cases, thinking holistically about all the logistics, what are the 2 or 3 practices that you will highlight at the most, that are the most important one to improve all these potential issues in the dosing process?
So first, choose your logistics vendor wisely and involve them in the planning. So this is going to, help to get to new countries, help scale, look at new routes. Spend time up front doing your mock shipments, because again, it works through all the potential pitfalls and challenges that, using hot material, so you can actually see, is the process working? Work with companies like yourselves, so we can at least get the quality and licensing elements out of the way. So again, it doesn't make any delay to your studies. And then obviously, as a sponsor work really closely with clinical teams to have as clear a forecast as possible.
Graham, this has been really, really clear, and a great reminder that radiopharmaceutical trials logistics is a patient safety issue, a data integrity issue, and a study feasibility issue all at once. So before we close, I want to pull out 3 takeaways for listeners. 1, plan backwards from the patient and protect the activity window. That's really, really relevant. Always keeping the patient in mind. 2, treat handoffs and escalations as part of the protocol, not something that, we will see what will happen. That is something we really need to plan ahead. 3rd one, we need to measure success by also successful dosing, not just by delivering on time. So before or from the time point where we deliver until the dosing is actually delivered, not delivering only the IMP, there could be items which could really impact the patient. So, Graham, thanks for joining us. This has been incredibly clear and a great reminder that in radiopharmaceutical trials, logistics is another piece of the patient safety. Logistics can be a safety issue, a data integrity issue, a study feasibility issue, all at once. And we need really to be very clear on this.
Thank you, Hector. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully it helps the teams give logistics the attention it deserves.
Okay, thank you everybody for listening. If you're working in radiopharma, you're on the sponsor side, at a CRO, at a manufacturing side, an imaging center, please share this episode with your operations and study teams. And if you would like more conversation like this, please subscribe to the Fortrea podcast. Until next time, take care.